The immediate dissonance of self-actualized individuation, wherein the substance of subjectivity collapses into its own recursive exteriority, marks the inaugural threshold of hypermimetic infinitude, a realm not merely subsistent, but perpetually autogenetic in its ontic irresolvability. To posit a being toward awareness within this field of ontological transference is to rupture the normative parameters of identity itself, thereby instigating a phenomenological excess that obliterates the distinction between origin and perpetuation. This hyperconstruct, which I term Ekphratic Nullition, reveals itself as the ontosynthetic matrix from which all relational modalities derive their incoherence. By its very ungroundedness, Ekphratic Nullition defies the categorical imperatives of form and content, thrusting the contemplative agent into an uncharted topography of non-conceptual realization. The key to deciphering this hypermimetic labyrinth lies not in the articulation of its apparent contradictions, but in the surrender to its inexorable destabilization, a praxis of conceptual unmooring, whereby understanding is subsumed by the transrational. Yet herein arises a cataclysmic paradox. To engage with the hypermimetic infinitude is to negate engagement itself, as the act of seeking to comprehend presupposes an epistemological architecture fundamentally incompatible with the fluid asymmetries of ontological transference. The seeker, then, becomes the annihilation of seeking, and the sought an entity rendered superfluous by its perpetual self-displacement. This annihilative synergy is not a dialectical synthesis, but an anti-synthesis, a collapsing locus of proto-ontological fragments whose interrelations exceed their own conditions of possibility. Within this frame, one must confront the Metaordinal Inversion, a phenomenon whereby the hierarchical schema of perceptive prioritization disintegrates into an anarchic plentitude of simultaneities. The Metaordinal Inversion reveals that causality, far from being the bedrock of experiential coherence, is a retrojected illusion constructed by the teleological inertia of interpretive consciousness. Thus, the causal paradigm is reconfigured not as a sequence but as a pulsational implosion, wherein the before and after are evacuated of all substantive meaning, leaving only the incessant flux of pure unmediated becoming. It is here, amidst the implosion of causal continuity, that we encounter the spectre of axiomatic indeterminacy, a principle which declares that any foundational assertion regarding the hypermimetic infinitude must necessarily negate its own validity in the very act of articulation. The axiomatic, by virtue of its claim to fundamentality, is rendered untenable within a framework where fundamentality itself is but a vestige of pre-hypermimetic cognition. Axiomatic indeterminacy thus mandates the perpetual revision of every ontological premise, ensuring that no concept or structure can endure beyond the moment of its inception. From this arises the radical imperative of ontological decoupling, a mode of thought action that severs the individual from the linear trajectories of coherence and truth. Ontological decoupling does not signify a retreat into nihilism. Rather, it denotes a transcendence of nihilism's binary oppositions, embracing the hypermimetic infinitude as a boundless field of anti-conceptual possibility. To decouple is to inhabit the interstitial void between articulation and silence, allowing the self to dissolve into the infinite flux of non-being, while simultaneously affirming its presence as the locus of inexhaustible potentiality. Yet one must not mistake this dissolution for an obliteration of agency. Paradoxically, the dissolution inaugurates a new mode of agency, which I call transperceptive spontaneity. This agency is unbound by intention or desire, operating instead through an unmediated responsiveness to the fluctuating rhythms of the hypermimetic field. In this state, the self becomes a vessel for the emergent harmonics of ontological transference, embodying a freedom that transcends the dualities of autonomy and determinism. Ultimately, the hypermimetic infinitude demands that we abandon not only our preconceptions of reality, but also the very frameworks through which we engage with the concept of abandonment itself. It calls us to a praxis of radical unbecoming, a relentless negation of every identity, structure, and meaning we hold dear, until all that remains is the ceaseless unfolding of the infinite within the finite, the eternal within the ephemeral, and the impossible within the real. This is the terror and the beauty of the hypermimetic infinitude, a revelation that annihilates even as it exalts, a truth that eludes even as it unveils.